FM at 103.7. This is State College's ESPN Radio, 103.7 and 1450. WQWK State College.
Now, ESPN Radio 103.7 and 1450 proudly present the coach and the commentator. For the next 60 minutes, join former Penn State basketball legends Joe and Jon Crispin as they take you through the latest news surrounding Penn State, college, and professional athletics, along with other relevant topics in modern sports culture. The coach and the commentator, exclusively on State College's ESPN Radio, is sponsored by Lion Country Kia. Now, here are your hosts, Jon and Joe Crispin.
Good afternoon, Happy Valley. I am ESPN college basketball analyst and former Penn Stater, the commentator in this equation, Jon Crispin, and pleased to be joined by my brother, the coach in all things, head coach of Rowan University men's basketball, former Penn State basketball legend. Episode 2 for us. So if anyone joined us Tuesday, you have an idea of what we're trying to do, really, and Joe, chime in. The goal is to take a deeper dive into different topics. Maybe topics that are popular topics, but really not just talk about things on the surface, kind of explore the layers and have a real conversation that is not just about what you should think. I mean, I feel like First Take, I feel like Get Up, a lot of the shows, the network I work for in the morning are telling you what to think. I think far too often that's what we do in the business. We tell you what to think. But the conversation we're trying to have, Joe, again, correct me if I'm wrong, the conversation we're trying to have is to help you think on your own. Doesn't mean we're right. Like I always say, just because you're right doesn't mean you're not wrong. Just because you're not wrong doesn't mean you're right. There's a lot of gray in these things. So I think what we did on Tuesday was we started to have the conversation about the state of college sports, particularly in college football and basketball. And I do think we did a decent job of getting deeper into the conversation and not just talking about things on the surface.
Decent, but that's why we're here for round 2.
Yeah, we need round 2. And we had mentioned kind of a quasi-tease. I can't call it a real tease because it wasn't that good. What we were going to do.
You could have done
Thursday.
better.
Yeah, could have done better. But we're just getting our feet wet. This is something I do for a living, but it's different it's different doing this with you because these are conversations we already have anyway, yet this has to be for an audience. So it's a little weird. It's definitely a little weird. And listening back to some of what we discussed on Tuesday, I realized I was too much of a commentator. I need to be more of not even a coach, but just a normal dude. So I can join the conversation a little bit more. But we did. We kind of teased a little bit what we wanted to get into Thursday, which was kind of expanding upon the conversation of the state of things in college sports. And you can't help but to have the conversation about the state of college sports and not make it all about basketball and football. Like, there's just no way around it. We know what the revenue sports are. We know that all the decisions that are being made at universities, throughout the conference level, throughout the country, even with kids deciding where they want to go and where they want to play and where they want to play next, frankly, with transfers being what they are. It really does come down to where things are with college football and basketball. And the question I had that I wanted to pick up on was, is where we're at sustainable? The professionalism of amateur sports, the big business that it is. I had the conversation with my agent earlier today. We talked about kind of where things are in the business, and the industry's weird because there's no stabilizing factor in the game right now where you have players being able to leave whenever they want, and understandably so given the business side of things. NIL is basically what's deciding where you go. It's not even about where the opportunity is best. It's not even about where you're going to have the opportunity to grow, develop accountability, good habits. It's really about where you can get paid. And the question I had was, is this sustainable? Can the sport survive for what it is, right? For the thing that we love, right? The fans that come out and support. At Penn State, people bleed blue and white. And it doesn't matter who's there year in, year out. They're going to keep coming out to support, but it's hard to support when you don't know who's there from year to year. So the question today is, how sustainable is our current system now that the business side of things is now on top of the table?
Well, as you mentioned, you asked like 2 questions. So I'll choose one. I'll choose the one I want to answer.
One you like, yep.
But I think last time we talked about money and just the amount of money involved and how everyone wants to get in on this booming market, a market that's been booming for 30 years. But I think the answer to can it be sustained is yes and no. On one hand, when there is enough public interest in a sport, just per se, which is what this is, then yes, it can be sustained. There's enough interest in it. But no, in the sense that it's not going to look exactly the same. And that's what we're working through and talking about right now is the growing pains of a business that wasn't supposed to be a business.
But my thing is, are they growing pains or are they dying pains? Because there's a piece of this that will never be the same, and the piece that will never be the same is the connection that student athletes have to those players, is the connection that these communities have to student athletes.
That's a valid point.
So for example, I always said this. I think Purdue was a great example of this because, and I bring up Purdue because they always had old guys, and they still to this day. Matt Painter will tell you that the goal is to get old and stay old. And they've always had guys that have been around 3, 4, even 5 years. And what that does to the connection to your fan base is something that you can't quantify. They see you on campus. You represent them in so many ways. They grow up with you. They've seen your failures, right? A lot of these guys, you get in trouble, you're a kid. The student population, they grow with you. They fall with you. They will get mad when you don't play well, and they will love you when you turn it all around, right? You have this weird thing Matt Harms always did. He flicked his hair and did his hair. The whole crowd started wearing hair like Matt Harms. The kid wasn't that good, but he connected with a fan base. And to me, that exemplified what I think is so special about college sports. I think about our NIT Final Four run, my freshman year, your sophomore year, when we beat Siena, right? We beat Siena. Like, we should have beaten Siena. Now, there's a deeper story to that. I know we were supposed to slow things down and
105, 103.
Grind a game out. We ended up playing our high school.
We threw out the scouting report and ignored probably
Jared.
What we were supposed to do.
Sorry, Jared.
We were running. We were let loose out of the cannon.
But it was fun, and what I'm talking about was after the game, right? People were inspired. They had fun. They rushed the court. Now, we beat Siena, and they rushed the court. Now, granted, this was to go to the NIT Final Four, which meant we were going to New York, but I remember crowd surfing. And I remember students on the floor and celebrating, and we're up on the scores table, and some guys are jumping off like myself. And there's nothing like that. But the connection's there because we represented our student body. Right? Is that ever going to be the same? Especially because we talked about the money. It's also the fact that the money is first on the line item, right? If there's a line item for everything that you are, right? Your attributes. The first thing that we talk about now is what a guy's worth financially. Oh, this kid's going to go to Memphis and he's going to get $1 million. Like, why is that the first thing we talk about? If that's what we're talking about, is there really a connection to students anymore?
The answer is yes and no. Because one, there is a connection and it is possible, but two, not in the same way. And when you talk about the finances and the marketability of an individual and the blatant professionalism of it, one, you can't blame the kid. You can't blame student athletes. I mean, this is the only system in the world. Now, granted, if you're 18 years old or you're 17 years old or you're Luka Doncic at 15 years old, you can move to Real Madrid and get paid a certain stipend until you really get paid at age 17 and 18 playing EuroLeague, which is what he did. So our system is unbelievably unique. It's the only one ever in the history of the world, right? But this is where I would want to go with it a little bit, because a lot of people don't understand the systems overseas that are in place, and most people understand the club system, but not about fully.
The junior club system.
Well, junior club system, the actual professional system is that you will have a junior club. If you want to be a successful club, you're going to have a development program, and you're going to invest into your own development program. Well, what our professional sports have done is benefit from the free development program of college. However, college came first. So these college games and the communities that surrounded these games really predated in influence the professional ranks. right? So the NBA had some leery years.
True.
So we have essentially a subsidized system in many respects because we've invested into athletics for well over 100 years collegiately. So will it look the same? No. And the problem is once money gets involved, there's not the same level of me and you on the same level as student athlete. And, sure, I might have had a scholarship, but, there's various kids on campus with scholarships, and we don't really think anything of it, usually because they're not on television, right? There's music scholarships, there's drama scholarships, there's art scholarships. But there's not necessarily that he got a full ride and he put a hat on in front of a camera and posted it to YouTube or ESPN for that matter. So, yeah, it's a different system, and it's a hard system where you have this educational mission, right? And people have been writing about this for years, this educational mission of the university, and then this big business that's come in the midst of this. And, it's always been... a difficult. I think about that old. Yeah. I'm flipping through the channels the other day, and the Revenge of the Nerds was on there.
Nerds.
And they got the football guys. Right? I don't remember the movie at all.
Right,
but
first off, let's just be real. Everything about that movie today is like not okay.
I watched 2.5 minutes. There's no way you can make that movie today in any way, shape, or form without offending everyone.
And how was Goose? How was Goose from Top Gun?
Yeah.
In that, what was his name? Ed something. I don't know his name, but either way, he's Goose. But he was one of the nerds. Takashi and the bike race, one of the greatest music, playlists of all time for that scene.
I think you watched this last week when it was on. I think you watched the whole thing.
It's just coming back to mind, like the Lambda Lambdas or the Lambda Moos or whatever they were. I don't know, whatever. Delta. I don't forget what it was, but either way, yeah, great. So glad you brought up Revenge of the Nerds, dude.
Well, if you think about it, like there was always this dichotomy of the educational mission, and then this one, it was the football team, and it was just like they were over the top with every single stereotype you could possibly come up with. And there was always this tension, right? There was always this combating tension. And, you can make movies of it and laugh about it. But, there was always this tension of like, where does sports fit in this equation? So you have people on this academic mission doing research who don't like any of the perks to athletics, and yet athletics does serve a positive purpose when it's done rightly to unify a community and get everyone into the stands, nerds or whatever, in the stands,
can't say that these days.
Cheering everybody on. Well, that was the stereotype back then. Yeah, imagine that. But anybody, any sport, any major, any whatever, you show up, you cheer on your team, you unify, and sports have that power in a way that maybe nothing else does, right? I love going to the theater, but not everybody likes going to the theater, right? There's something about sports that gets us there.
All right, so
that's why the money is where it is. It's so popular.
So that's the irony, right? It's unified in so many ways, but it's also been utilized as a kind of a dividing topic. I mean, it's divisive in so many ways because we're in this choose a side society. I want to have the hypothetical conversation that is, there is no social media. And how does all this stuff happen without social media, and does it happen better? That's the conversation I want to have. So let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about maybe how things would have or could have moved or worked without social media as an influence, because I think that has influenced things and it's made things move too quickly and maybe in a direction that isn't sustainable. So we'll have that conversation.
Now, back to the Coach and the Commentator with Joe and Jon Crispin on ESPN Radio 103.7 and 1450.
Welcome back. It's the Coach and the Commentator with Joe and Jon Crispin. We are having the conversation about, the sustainability of college sports in a world of name, image, and likeness, in a world of transfer whenever you want. Frankly, in a world where college sports is a big business, and the big business is on top of the table, it's not done underneath. Frankly, I always liked when it was just done underneath the table. I was like, we know it's happening, but it's somehow okay. The fact that we put it on top of the table we now bring out how much everybody's getting, right? And if somebody else is getting something that I'm not, I had a good year, I'm going to transfer, you're going to give me a better deal. The question I posed before we went to break is something that I think is really interesting, because it's impossible to truly quantify the influence of something like social media on all levels, right? How many coaches didn't get jobs that they were supposed to get because of the outrage on social media? Like, I know a few situations that are actually tied to Penn State. Situations where people are the right person for the job, but they may not even have a strong enough social media presence. Maybe like myself. How many times have you heard administrators or, corporate heads say, I don't really pay attention to that stuff. I don't listen to that stuff, but you should have a stronger presence on social media. I don't really pay attention to all that stuff, but if this is what the fans are saying, well, that's not what the fans are saying. Just a few angry fans, and you have to listen to them. Social media does have an influence, and I think social media has strongly influenced this, particularly when you consider some of my colleagues at ESPN. I mean, Jay Billis was in front of all this, really pushing. And social media was the platform that got the word out. Social media was also the platform where you could find that loud minority that said, yes, these poor kids deserve more. I think the majority of people would say, yeah, I do think kids deserve something. But to what end, to what degree, and what is sustainable, that's the real question. But those on Twitter, those on Facebook, those on Instagram, those really trying to drum this up, they made it kind of crazy. So, Joe, I pose the question to you. What does this look like if not for social media?
What's anything look like if not for social media? That's part of the question we got to ask. I think you mentioned a couple things in terms of college athletics and where we are today, especially in the big things of but it's not just football and men's basketball, though they're typically your money generating sports. It's the social media presence of people who are playing any sport, men or women, who make a lot of money through social media.
But do they really make a lot of money? That's the funny thing.
I don't know.
Million followers.
But they
don't make any money. The money they're making is based on, I have 1 million people who follow me and 300,000 people like my picture, so these people are going to pay me to promote a product. That's how they make money, but even then, it's not that.
Well, yeah, that's how they make money. Yes, exactly, through social media, and then there becomes this distinction between have and have-nots. Then what you mentioned in I mean in your own locker room and on your own campus, I think we all agree, like it's a difficult thing to discern through. But there's also all this information, some of which is probably completely inaccurate. Some
of which, social media has ruined our own news outlets. Our news outlets can't be honest with news anymore. It has to be one way or another. It has to be filled with motivations and agenda. And
stay on task though. Is that right, I mean, just take a step back, and if you're an agent for a college player, which is essentially what these brokers are, or whatever, who are brokering deals. I mean, that's what my agent did when I was a pro. It is in your interest, if you have other clients, to inflate what so-and-so is getting, right? To increase the price of this market. Now, will they reach some sort of bubble phase? Possibly. But when you hear kids who, he's getting $500,000 and everyone looks side-eye going, he's getting what? It's like those guys who used to come back from overseas and they're like, yeah, I'm getting 70 a month. And I'm like, no, you're not. No, you're not getting, like, I know where you played. You're not getting 70 a month, right? I don't know why you're saying you're getting 70 a month, but no one's getting 70 a month over there, right?
Yep.
So there's this information glut going around that is being able to be driven by, because an individual or an agent or whoever can just put out a tweet, and that tweet is authority enough to report on that, right? Or a series of tweets.
But my point is, does all this happen as quickly as it did if not for social media?
Well, nothing happens.
Nothing happens as quickly. Yeah.
Social media just is a launching pad for anything, whatever it might be. But I think the other thing that we've talked about is this notion of social media as a means of turning you in on yourself, right? So I'm reading this book Irresistible I mentioned last time, and
was that your book recommendation?
That was my book recommendation. But really, that's any bit of research shows that, right? You can do your own research, and it's easy to get lost in your little world. Well, when you were in college, and I still use this term because I get a lot of transfers as a coach, I always say to players, and this is like my pitch, especially with transfers, and really with anybody, I'm looking for kids who want to find a home. That's who I'm looking for. They got to be really good, right? They got to be really good players because, hey, let's face it, the best thing I can do for Rowan is not just bring in players who want to be there, but who are good, right? Yep. Rowan wants us to win. They want us to be successful. We want to represent them by being excellent. But I ask them all the time, are you ready to find a home? Do you value finding a home? The way this works right now in our current sports culture and recruiting culture, that's often the last thing on kids' minds. And that's a huge mistake. It's a disservice to those kids. Now, if a kid's coming from poverty and so-and-so is offering him a couple $100,000 over top of a scholarship, I can't argue with him. And hopefully they do a good job with it, though. That's hard for college kids to do no matter where they come from. But I can't argue with that at all because there is, and I understand the argument that there's so much money out there that these kids should benefit from it, and they shouldn't just be relying on Pell Grants and everything else. I 100% am with that. But in our current climate, these kids still want to find a home. And this is the mistake that I think a lot of kids make when they leave, right? They leave for that grad transfer. They leave for that senior year. They get this better offer. And it's like when I, was a pro, I was a hired mercenary in many respects. Yeah. I didn't want to be, but I was in search of a home. And that's why are we here? Why are we doing this? Because Penn State's home for us, right? Yeah. I was looking for a home. I didn't know that, but I probably did know that better than the vast majority of college athletes at the time. But there were more of us back then.
But don't we eventually get back to that, though? Because I think there was a time where that is what you looked for. I mean, I talked to Jess Settles a few weeks ago, something I was doing for Sirius. I mean, the same thing you did, the Big Ten Legends. There's nothing worse than having to interview your brother. You're Big Ten Legends. You're not the legend. But I had Jess Settles on.
Get on the wing. Go stand over there.
Decoy.
I'll pass it to you if you're open. All right.
Do jumping jacks. If my man helps, I'll get the ball. So Jess was one of the guys. He's an Iowa guy. He's a farmer, still has a farm, and he always knew he wanted to go to Iowa. And it was a matter of whether he was good enough, right? And he wanted to show and prove that he was good enough. But he always knew that's where he belonged. And there was never a question of, if I'm not playing enough, do I go someplace else? It was how much harder do I have to work to be who I want to be for this program? That feels like it's being sacrificed in the name of progress. But I ultimately feel like we're going to end up back there again because all these things, if they don't work, we go back to what did work. And there was a time where the model did work for kids. Where it
didn't always work, though. It didn't always work. And I do think there's some benefits to being able to, for kids to be able to move easier, because there are kids who have missed out on opportunities. You said last time your best season was the year you had to sit out, right? And you were right. Yeah. And you were coming off a good year and you lost some momentum and stuff like that. So there were some drawbacks to that system. But I also
had 5 foot surgeries and 2 different coaches the next 2 years, so that wasn't really.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. The timing was terrible too, but. You saw those banners and you couldn't say no, but
my ego couldn't say no.
Oh, that's why you couldn't say no. But the thing about it is, even on a larger scale, right? Is I think you end up back there for not most programs, but for a lot of programs. Yeah, there are some, the elite of the elite, the biggest of the biggest, who maybe can operate in that professional sports world and just they don't care. Right? They don't care if the team represents the community or fits in the community the way they should. It's professional sports, right?
Plus Kentucky basketball.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. That's just what they want. That's what they've always wanted.
Frankly, UCLA, soon to be a Big Ten member. Same thing. They just want the best. They don't care what it costs.
But that's not everyone. And I think some of those conversations that people have had about. I was watching the Clemson game the other day, and they were talking about Sweeney. and how Sweeney, how do you pronounce
Dabo
his name?
Sweeney. Yeah.
Dabo Sweeney. Dabo. I just call him Davis, so I forgot his last name. And they were talking about just how he's approached the transfer portal. I have no idea if he's right, but if that's his vision and if that's what he thinks fits Clemson community and Clemson football, he might be right for that particular circumstance. And he wants to put things in the context of community. He wants players who are community involved. That's what I have heard on the surface. I have
I was
no
going
idea.
to say, I think he's saying a lot of that.
I have no idea. But if you don't want to play that game and if you don't want to enter into that market because you don't think that's what's best for your particular program, somebody's going to be right about that, right? And number two, that's going to be true for the most people. There's only so much of that high-level competitive element around, right? There's only so much of the cream of the crop who want to enter into that professional sports world. And that's the same thing, John, and this is where you talk about the professional sports world overseas. It's like I saw every single level, and depending on the level and depending on what the team you played, you had to approach even that business world in a different way. So even if you want to talk about it as a business, you have to approach it community by community to find your fit.
Yeah. It's all right. So I do think that we have to spin off this because to me, the next question is, how does today's climate, today's environment, how does it work at Penn State? And we'll stick with basketball. But I think you and I have an interesting perspective on it. Hey, we played there. We do understand what makes Penn State special from a community standpoint. And the community is probably the most important part about Penn State from our perspective. But also just understanding the overall climate of sports as it is today with what I do, with what you do, obviously me as a commentator, seeing everybody around the country, you as a coach who you're dealing with this stuff. You're dealing with the kids firsthand. I want to have the conversation about how it may work at Penn State, because I feel like you can get transfers. Kids may come and go, but there still has to be some sense of core. At least from my perspective, there may have to be some sense of a core that is true to what Penn State's all about. So we'll have that conversation next. Take a break and let's talk about whether Penn State basketball can thrive the way the world is today. It's Coach and the Commentator with Crispin Brothers.
Now, back to the Coach and the Commentator with Joe and John Crispin on ESPN Radio 103.7 and 1450.
Welcome back. It's the Coach and the Commentator with Joe and John Crispin. We're talking about the sustainability of college sports, particularly on the football and basketball side of things. Just name, image, and likeness. Better offers out there, the ability to transfer. And I always felt like it's probably hardest for those who aren't established, those who aren't really established as a powerhouse, the places like the Kentucky where Oscar Tshiebwe is getting near $2 million right now. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that in Los Angeles there's opportunities to make a lot of money if you can transfer and have a big name. There are a lot of places out there that aren't doing it that way, and they never will because that's just not who they are. Yet, here's the interesting thing. I think there are opportunities for some of these, we'll call it smaller market programs, like a Penn State, to be a star in your smaller fishbowl, per se. I mean, that's kind of like what you and I got to enjoy, right? We were bigger fish in a smaller bowl, smaller pond, whatever you want to call it, in the sense that Penn State wasn't in a pro sports town. Are there unique opportunities to be someone bigger as a transfer? Can you hit that market? Does that work at a place like Penn State? You're dealing with this in Rowan where you said you get a lot of transfers. How much does we have 1 year, one time to transfer? How much does that play into things when you're making the decision as a coach? Because you got to think at Penn State, you're getting kids that maybe this is their one opportunity to transfer. They're making a better decision because it's their one opportunity to transfer. Does that change how you view the transfer market? And does that maybe change how you view it if you're Penn State or a smaller market team like that?
Well, I think I hope that one-time transfer thing sticks. I'm skeptical. I think they're going to be handing out exceptions like crazy.
Just like they did it before.
Yeah, they're going to be handing out and just going, oh yeah, you want one? Here it is. Here it is.
They're still dealing with the COVID exceptions.
Yeah. Well, and that's why you get the old players.
Yeah.
I think what you alluded to about the the big markets, right? Typically in the professional sports world, the big market teams think they, maybe rightly most times, because they have more money, they have more margin for error, right? So they can rebuild quickly. All right, we made a mistake this second half of the year. Let's scrap him, and him. We're going to buy him, and him, and we're going to win the second part of the year or the first half. Like you see that with Premier League teams. They have a greater money, typically can give them, it's supposed to give them a greater margin for error. You see that in the high levels of EuroLeague. They stock up more players, right? So the best teams have 11.
For example, when you played in Ukraine, crazy enough, one of your last stops was
Mariupol, which sadly is bombed out right now. Yeah.
You were one of 3 Americans on that team, correct? Of which only 2 could play.
I was probably one of 3 Americans, maybe. Yeah, I think it was 3, but there was multiple Europeans, so it was a more open team. But we had certain roster limitations. They would keep extra players, so there were nights off because we played a lot of games. We traveled a lot, so there were nights that I had the night off just because it was in the rotation and matchups and whatever else, and I loved it because at that point I was 32. But that's what happens on those bigger market teams. Well, what is it about that? It's they are giving themselves more room to mess up. They have the money to fire their coach and hire another one. They have the money to go out in the transfer window and spend $2.2 billion like the Premier League clubs team. So in your smaller market teams, which I also played for, even mostly, you have less room for error. You have less room for injuries. You have less room for a bad hire. You have less room for, whatever issues arise, right? You have whatever it is, you have less room for losses or wins because you can't just recover by stocking up in the middle of the year. So that's essentially what you're talking about in this environment, whether it's the Oklahoma City Thunder or it's Penn State basketball. It's a smaller market economy, so you have less room for error, but you naturally want to build up your recruiting base or your program and your roster in such a way that you have a healthy depth, that's based on years, that's based on culture, that's based on
that's what I was going to say.
Familiarity with the.
How do you define depth these days, Bill? Because depth used to be maybe a freshman that becomes a sophomore that's working his way up into the program, and he's going to play more and more significant minutes, but he understands the culture, he understands the pieces, the players, the coaches, the verbiage, all the communication that you kind of learn over your time. That's kind of what depth used to be. Reliable for a few minutes, maybe not reliable in late game situations. Depth now is more like how many weapons can we acquire, and how much can we get. That's
the problem too. Is that depth at the highest level, and I mean even my team, we're not a perennial powerhouse, but we're good, and our depth is older than your depth most of the time.
Yeah.
So one of the things that would make me a better coach, and does make me a better coach, Lord willing, we're healthy, is my 8th guy is older than your 6th guy.
Yeah.
So there's something with age, and again, I think Penn State Coach Shrews is figuring this out, and he's gotten some older transfers, and any of these coaches, that's what they're often doing, is they still need to develop young players, and they're recruiting young players they think can fit their community and their program, but they still know they need some age and wisdom who are just comfortable in the game itself, right? And that's something is again, you have to get it right, but that is the game that everyone's playing, and it is completely and radically understandable. There's some things you lose to that, right? Yeah. You lose that whole continuity that you're talking about, though. I think a lot of it was that continuity that we thought everyone had. There were certain kids that in any program that really didn't fit as much as people thought, but they were like, it's too much of a hassle for me to go anywhere else, right?
Can you have culture without continuity? And because to me, culture is consistency. Like this thing, we talk about culture all the time, say, oh, Villanova culture, love their culture. It's like, but it's because they consistently do the same things, and their focus is on these core things. This is what makes us. Culture to me is consistency. So in so many ways, is culture sacrificed? Or Does that mean if you're going to go the route of bringing new pieces in that will be leaders on your team? I had this conversation with Chris Holtman where he's like, gosh, I got to rely on Jamari Wheeler to be more of a leader because Jamari Wheeler took that fifth year at Ohio State. And he says, he's definitely one of my leaders, yet he's not a guy that's been through our system. He's not a guy that knows our language in so many ways, but I trust his experience and I trust what motivates him. So in a way, that's an adjustment from Chris Holtman's standpoint where you have to adjust to,
that's a smart adjustment. That's hard to do. I think that's you talk about the professional sports mindset. It's like that's like saying, can Armani Jeans have a good culture?
Yeah.
Yes, they can have a good culture. They're not going to be a EuroLeague contender without good culture. Can Chelsea have a good culture? They're moving in and out of players all the time, but there's usually one or two that are their keystones, right? Yeah. And I think that's the adjustment a lot of coaches have had to make is that when they would think of culture, they thought of it very narrowly, right? They thought of it very, based on how many days you get with a certain person so that they're thinking and talking and acting like you.
Well, I feel like culture, too, is very superficial, where it's like it's almost something that you can see and point at, when the truth is, like culture is much deeper than that.
Well, yeah, and plus, like, I don't know if I shared this on Tuesday or not, because I say this often, but one of the things that we want to be in our culture is that a really good player comes in and I guarantee him nothing. And if he doesn't do what he needs to do, he doesn't play. That's important to our culture. Well, if you really dig beneath the surface of that, that's not easy to do. And that's a little bit messy to do. And that can mess on your culture in a traditional sense, right? And I think a lot of times what the way we talk about culture, the way young people talk, I don't think I'm old, but young coaches talk about culture. They've read a couple books and they're like, this is what the best teams look like. And they tuck their shirts in. And it's a very fragile culture because the moment any of those things get disrupted, it's very fragile. And you and I are on the same page of, one of my favorite words is anti-fragility. And, we want our teams to be anti-fragile. Well, that's what you're requiring of coaches and programs today is to be able to adjust, to be able to grow in the chaos. And, when you talk about small market teams like our alma mater, that's important. That's important to them. And that's really, really hard to do. It's really, really hard to do.
It's hard to do, but it's also, it's funny. We talk about having a set, strong culture, yet the culture itself has to be anti-fragile. Is that what you're saying, right? Like it's culture can't be so rigid that it is this or it's not at all. The culture itself has to have that adjustability. I use the term adjustability again. I know it's not a word, but I feel like adaptability has been screwed up in this in society, right? We think adaptability where we have to change. We have to change the way we think, to change the way we do things to almost assimilate in so many ways. So I think adaptability is not the right word for me. Adjustability, where on the fly, you just say, we can roll with it. We can roll with that. Okay, yeah, let's roll with that. Like you just adjust on the move. I always say best teams don't win with set plays. They win with adjustments. My question to you is, how different is it? Or is it different at all? I mean, look, you deal with kids who want to or think they're going pro, and they're Division III players. So, like, is it that much different? Like, because I all I can do is think about myself, and you can think about yourself, maybe guys we played with. I think, to me, when I'm trying to understand the kids today, I go to UCLA, my time at UCLA, where I played with 10 All-Americans, and everybody expects the most. Everybody expects to start and be the star. Like, it feels like the whole world of sports is full of those guys that do expect the most. And how challenging is it to win with that and win right away? Because it's kind of the world we're in. It's the win now mentality, especially if you're dealing with fourth or fifth year transfers.
Well, I think one of the most important things, and I'm sure most coaches have gotten there, although some who have been in the business for a long time, I think, struggle with it, is, sitting down with kids and just saying, what do you want? Like, answer a simple question. Yeah. What do you want? And anytime we have a recruit on campus and we have lunch, that's where I start. What do you want? And if he doesn't know, he's probably not my guy, right? He's probably not my guy. So if he knows what he wants and it is somewhat in line with what we want, now you can be my guy, right?
Well, now it's up to you.
Yeah. And now, like, what do you want? And that's where a lot of kids coming out of high school and a lot of kids who they've been worried about their rankings for like 6 years.
Yeah.
Man, like that's why small market teams aren't going after a lot of those kids. And that's rightfully so. That's wise. But if a kid, transfers, for example, they at least are clear about what they want, that they want to be there, that they value this experience. You can work with those kids just like you can work with free agents who choose to sign with you, not just because of the amount that's on that paycheck.
It's like Kevin Durant.
Yeah, and because of what it can do for your career. But part of it is he is searching for what he wants, maybe. Yeah. Maybe he's not clear about what he wants, right? I understand that. I mean, when you have so many forces pulling you, and that's the other dynamic for these kids, there are so many forces pulling these kids. We talked about it last week. There's forces pulling kids and their parents at grade 5, let alone kids who have some financial thing that people can benefit from. That's a really, really difficult place to be. So to cavalierly just say like, oh, it should be easy for people to figure out what they want, I think is completely it's just completely wrong.
It's absurd because I'm 41 years old, or maybe 42. No, I'll be 42. I'm 41 years old, and I'm still trying to figure that out, right? Like, there's still that part of you that's like, you get to where you thought you wanted to get, and you're still wanting more. So, undoubtedly, kids are going to go through the same thing. All right, we're going to take a break. We're going to wrap things up. We've got a few more minutes left. We'll talk about what we're going to get into next week. But I do think there's a lot more to discuss when it pertains to the culture of sports, whether it's at the youth level that works its way into the level we're discussing. But the professionalism of amateur sports it's going to be a huge, huge change, and you may not recognize it for a while. But the hope is that we do find a plan that is sustainable. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll wrap it all up. It's Joe and Jon Crispin, the coach and the commentator.
Now back to the coach and the commentator with Joe and Jon Crispin on ESPN Radio 103.7 and 1450.
Welcome back. It's the coach and the commentator with Joe and Jon Crispin. I'm ESPN college basketball analyst Jon Crispin, joined by my brother, the coach, head coach, Rowan University men's basketball, former Nittany Lion legend, Joe Crispin. And we've been talking this week about kind of the culture of sports, the state of amateur athletics, if we're still going to even call it that. I think this conversation continues next week, but we're going to do some different things going forward. We're going to start talking about what it's like coaching your kids, maybe where some of these issues start. But we're also going to do a little something next week. We'll talk a little football in a segment that I like, what you named it. It's stuff we know about stuff we don't know much about. Love it. Absolutely love it. Again, talk a little football and the stuff we know about.
There'll be plenty of content in that category.
Don't really know much about. Yeah, it's good. But we are going to start.
Especially from the commentator.
Well, yeah, I'll have a little something for you. If we talk a little football, we'll break down the game against Ohio. Hopefully it's a positive ending. We're going to start to have some special guests, especially as basketball starts to roll around, to add to the conversation. But there's so much for us to get to. The topic will be similar in the sense where we are breaking down the culture of sports and the state of amateur athletics because it's something I think we all love, we all cherish, we don't want to lose. But we'll continue that. But again, I'm excited because I like the name of it. Stuff we know about stuff we don't know much about. I love it. That's very commentator-esque. It's been good.
You can steal it just like you steal my other good stuff. That's good.
I do steal some stuff. I try to change a word or two. It's kind of like how I wrote papers back in the day. It's been a good week. Good start. I think people get an idea of how we're starting to look at things, a deeper dive, a deeper look, different layers, and have a real conversation. We'll pick the conversation up next week. Enjoy football. Hopefully fall weather's upon us. Not a better place to be than State College in September, October. It's the coach and the commentator with Joe and Jon Crispin. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening to The Coach and the Commentator with hosts Joe and Jon Crispin. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. for new episodes, only heard on ESPN Radio 103.7 and 1450. The Coach and the Commentator is sponsored by Lion Country Kia.